The Netherlands stretches flat against the horizon. A country built below the sea, where the sky seems larger than the land it covers. Water moves through everything here. It flows between rows of brick houses, pools in quiet canals, and presses constantly against earthen walls that have held for centuries. This is not a place that exists by accident. It exists because generation after generation chose to stay, to dig, to pump, and to build what nature never intended to give them. More than a quarter of this small nation sits beneath sea level. The rivers Rhine, Meuse, and Scheldt pour into a delta where land and water have never agreed on a boundary. What looks like solid ground is often reclaimed seabed, drained polders where the soil itself was engineered into existence. Windmills once did the work of lifting water from fields that would otherwise flood. Today, massive storm barriers and pumping stations continue that same work. Invisible to most visitors, but essential to everything they see. Beyond the engineering, another country reveals itself. Tidal islands rise from shallow northern seas, their beaches stretching toward open water. Medieval towns cluster around church towers and market squares, their stone walls softened by centuries of weather. Tulip fields stripe the spring landscape in impossible color. Fishing villages hold on to traditions that predate the modern ports, now handling more cargo than almost anywhere else in Europe. The Dutch story is not one of conquest over nature, but of negotiation with it. Every dike, every canal, every drainage system represents a decision made and maintained. A relationship that cannot be abandoned without consequence. From the barrier islands of the Wadden Sea to the storm surge gates of the southern delta, from the canal rings of old cities to the experimental wilderness of reclaimed land. This is a country that reveals its complexity slowly, rewarding those who look past the surface to understand what lies beneath. The barrier islands mentioned earlier rise from these shallow northern seas, and Texel stands as the largest and most westerly of the Wadden chain. A short ferry ride from the mainland carries visitors to a place where the Dutch relationship with water takes on a different character. Here, the North Sea crashes against western shores, while the Wadden Sea laps gently at eastern mudflats. This island has learned to exist between two very different worlds of water. Texel stretches roughly 25 kilometers from north to south, yet contains landscapes that seem borrowed from separate countries. Wide sandy beaches give way to rolling dunes covered in marram grass and sea buckthorn. Inland, sheep graze on polders reclaimed centuries ago. their wool prized for quality, shaped by salt air and coastal grasses. Small villages dot the interior, their brick houses and whitewashed churches standing as quiet markers of island life. The island serves as a crossroads for migrating birds, drawing species from across Europe and beyond. Nature reserves cover nearly a third of the land, protecting habitats where spoonbills nest and seals haul out onto sandbanks exposed by retreating tides. Lighthouses mark the northern and southern tips, their beams sweeping across waters that have claimed countless ships over the centuries. Texel carries its maritime history in shipwreck museums and in the weathered faces of fishing boats still working from the harbour at Udeshild. Beyond Texel, the full expanse of the Wadden Sea Region spreads along the Dutch coast. This vast tidal flat system stretches along the Dutch coast, recognized by UNESCO for its ecological importance. Twice each day, the sea retreats to expose mudflats that connect islands to the mainland. Seals rest on exposed sandbars, while millions of migratory birds pause here on journeys spanning continents. Terschelling rises from these shallow waters as one of the most beloved of the West Frisian Islands. Sandy beaches line its northern shore, facing the open North Sea with dunes that shift and rebuild with each passing storm. Cranberry bogs dot the island's interior, and a reminder of failed cultivation attempts that nature reclaimed for itself. Villages with red-roofed cottages cluster along protected harbours where fishing boats still tie up each evening. The Brandaris Lighthouse stands watch over Terschelling from the main village of West Terschelling. Built in 1594, this square brick tower has guided sailors through treacherous shoals for more than 4 centuries. Its light sweeps across waters that have claimed countless ships over the years. From its base, the village spreads outward in narrow streets where islanders have made their living from the sea for generations beyond counting. Turning inland from these tidal flats, the city of Groningen rises in the far north with a character distinctly its own. Here, the flatness feels even more pronounced, the sky stretching endlessly above brick spires and tree-lined canals. This is a university city, home to one of the oldest institutions of higher learning in the country. Students have cycled these streets since 1614. Their presence shaping the rhythm of daily life for more than 4 centuries. The Grotemarkt sits at the heart of everything, a grand market square dominated by the Martini Toren. This church tower climbs nearly 100 meters into the northern sky, its medieval silhouette visible from surrounding farmland for kilometers in every direction. Locals call it simply the Old Grey, a name earned through centuries of weathering against North Sea winds. From its viewing platform, the city spreads outward in concentric rings of canal and cobblestone. Beyond the central square, Groningen reveals quieter pleasures. The Noorderplantsoen Park curves through the western neighborhoods, following the path of former city walls. Brick warehouses converted into cafes line inner canals where small boats drift past. The city moves at bicycle pace, unhurried yet purposeful. Museums dedicated to maritime history and regional art occupy former merchant houses. Evening light falls across facades painted in deep reds and ochres, and colors that seem to hold warmth even under gray autumn skies. South of Groningen, one structure stands apart in scale and ambition. Among all the works that define this negotiation between land and sea, the Afsluitdijk stretches 32 kilometers across open water, a ribbon of road and barrier connecting the provinces of North Holland and Friesland. Completed in 1932, this massive dam transformed the Zuiderzee from a dangerous inland sea into the freshwater IJsselmeer. What once threatened coastal communities with storm surges and flooding became a controlled body of water, managed and contained. Driving across feels like traveling through emptiness itself. Water extends on both sides, separated only by this narrow causeway of boulder and clay. The North Sea pushes against the western edge, while the calmer lake spreads to the east. Sluice gates at either end regulate the flow, releasing excess water during low tide and holding firm when storms arrive. The engineering required to build this barrier in the early 20th century demanded years of labor and millions of cubic meters of material hauled across open water. The Afsluitdijk did more than protect against floods. It enabled the creation of entire new provinces. Land that exists today because this dam made reclamation possible. Flevoland, now home to hundreds of thousands of people, rose from the drained seabed behind its protection. A monument stands at the midpoint, a marking where workers from both shores met to close the final gap. This single structure changed the geography of a nation, turning saltwater fresh and transforming what the map itself shows as solid ground. East of the Great Dam, that same patient negotiation with water finds its most peaceful expression in a village called Giethoorn, sitting quietly among reed-lined canals. Here, the relationship between land and water reaches a kind of harmony rarely seen elsewhere in the country. No cars move through the oldest parts of this settlement. Instead, small boats glide beneath wooden bridges, carrying residents and visitors along waterways that serve as the only streets. Thatched roof farmhouses line the canals, their gardens spilling colour toward the water's edge. These homes date back centuries, built on small islands created when villagers dug peat from the surrounding marshland. The peat extraction left channels that eventually filled with water, shaping the village into its current form. What began as practical necessity became something beautiful over time. The silence here strikes visitors most of all. Electric boats hum softly past willows that droop towards still reflections. Footbridges arc over narrow passages, connecting one green island to the next. Ducks paddle between lily pads, while herons stand motionless in the shallows. Life in Giethoorn moves at the pace of water itself. Unhurried and constant, a rhythm that has continued for generations without need for change. Returning to the IJsselmeer's western shore, we find Hoorn, a place where the golden age of Dutch seafaring left its permanent mark. This small city on the IJsselmeer once sent ships across every ocean, its merchants and captains writing chapters of world history from these quiet streets. The wealth that flowed back built grand houses and filled warehouses that still line the waterfront. Today, Hoorn carries its past with understated pride, a living museum of Dutch maritime ambition. The Grote Markt spreads out at the heart of the old town. Surrounded by stepped gable facades that have watched centuries pass. The Westfries Museum occupies a building from 1632, with its ornate exterior telling visitors immediately that serious money once changed hands here. Narrow streets branch outward from this central square, each one revealing more architectural treasures from the 1600s. Local markets still gather here, continuing traditions that stretch back to when Hoorn rivaled Amsterdam in importance. The harbour remains the soul of this town, its waters now filled with pleasure boats rather than merchant vessels. Stone quays built to handle cargo from distant colonies still edge the waterfront, solid and patient. The Hoofdtoren, a defensive tower from 1464, guards the harbour entrance as it has for more than 500 years. From these docks, and ships once departed for the East Indies, returning with spices that made fortunes and shaped empires. Walking along the water at dusk, the weight of that history settles quietly over everything. Just south along the water from Hoorn, Volendam stands apart. Among the fishing villages that hold on to older ways. This small town grew where fresh water meets memory, its harbour shaped by generations who pulled their living from the inland sea. Wooden boats still line the waterfront here. The smell of smoked eel drifts from shops that have sold the same catch for more than 100 years. The traditional fishing harbour remains the soul of Volendam. Stone quays edge the water where vessels once departed before dawn and returned heavy with fish. Green-painted houses crowd together along the dike, their facades bright against grey northern skies. Nets dry in the open air between boats that have seen better decades but refuse to disappear entirely. This harbour never became a museum, though it sometimes feels like one. Families still work here, mending what needs mending, keeping traditions alive through practice rather than performance. Walking the harbour at low tide reveals the patience this life demands. Gulls circle overhead, calling to each other across the water. Old men sit on benches, worn smooth by decades of watching. The rhythm here moves slower than the modern Netherlands rushing past on highways just kilometers away. Volendam asks nothing of its visitors except attention, and offering in return a glimpse of what coastal Dutch life looked like before the great engineering projects changed everything. The water still defines this place, as it always has, as it always will. The land that Volendam's fishermen once worked as open water now tells its story most clearly in Flevoland, the youngest province in the Netherlands. This entire region did not exist a century ago. Where farms and forests now stand, water once covered everything. The seabed itself was pumped dry, transformed into solid ground through sheer determination and engineering precision. Shockland rises from the flat polder landscape like a memory of what came before. Once an island in the Zuiderzee, it now sits surrounded by farmland rather than water. Fishermen and their families lived here for centuries, battling floods and isolation until the government evacuated them in 1859. The old church still stands on its raised mound, looking out over fields that were once open sea. Walking the former shoreline, the change feels almost impossible to believe. Oostvaardersplassen offers a different kind of experiment entirely. This wetland reserve was never planned. When the Flevoland was drained in the 1960s, this low section remained waterlogged and wild. Nature took hold before developers could. Marshes formed, birds arrived by the thousands, and scientists decided to let it grow without interference. Herds of wild horses and cattle now roam through reed beds and grasslands. The reserve has become one of Europe's most unusual wilderness areas, proof that even manufactured land can return to something untamed. West of Flevoland's engineered landscape, that story of negotiation with water finds its clearest expression along the banks of the Zaanse River. Zaanse Schans rises from the flat green landscape like a village lifted from another century. Wooden houses, painted in deep greens and greys, line the waterway. The air carries the scent of sawdust and the faint creak of turning machinery. This is not a museum frozen in time, but a living collection of Dutch industrial heritage. The working windmills stand as the heart of this place. Their massive wooden blades catch the wind and spin against skies that seem to stretch forever. Each mill serves a different purpose, grinding mustard seed, producing oil, or sawing timber into planks. Inside, the mechanics remain unchanged from centuries past. Wooden gears mesh and turn, powered by nothing but moving air. Millers still climb the narrow stairs to adjust the sails and monitor the grinding stones. The sound of the machinery fills the interior, a rhythmic pulse that has not stopped for generations. Beyond the mills, craft traditions continue in small workshops scattered through the village. The clog workshop draws visitors into the world of traditional Dutch footwear. Blocks of willow and poplar wood sit stacked near machines that hollow them into shape. Craftsmen demonstrate the carving process, their tools moving with practiced speed. What once took hours by hand now happens in minutes, though the final touches still require human skill. The finished clogs line the walls in every size and color, some plain and practical, others painted with bright floral designs meant for display rather than wear. Continuing westward from the Zaanse, Haarlem emerges from the same flat delta lands just 15 kilometers from Amsterdam. Church spires rise above rooftops here, marking a skyline that has changed little in 400 years. Canals thread through neighborhoods where brick facades lean slightly toward the water. This is a place where the 17th century left its fingerprints on nearly every corner. The Grote Markt spreads out at the city's heart, a vast square dominated by the Sint-Baverkerk. This Gothic church took over 150 years to complete, its tower visible from surrounding farmland. Inside, a pipe organ once played by both Handel and a young Mozart still fills the space with sound. Market days bring vendors and residents together beneath the same open sky their ancestors knew. Haarlem earned its reputation as a city of painters and craftsmen during the Dutch Golden Age. Frans Hals captured local faces in portraits that still hang in museums bearing his name. The courtyards of former almshouses, called hofjes, remain tucked behind street-front walls. Quiet gardens hide within these hidden spaces, offering rest from cobblestone streets. The River Spaan curves through the old centre, its banks lined with houseboats and converted warehouses that speak to centuries of trade and adaptation. South of Haarlem, the tulip fields that stripe the spring landscape find their fullest expression at Keukenhof Gardens, which opens its gates for only 8 weeks each year. This is not a garden in the ordinary sense. It is a carefully orchestrated explosion of color, planted fresh each autumn and blooming in waves as winter releases its grip. More than 7 million bulbs push through the soil here, transforming 32 hectares into one of the most photographed landscapes on Earth. The grounds date back to the 15th century, when they served as a kitchen garden for a nearby castle. Herbs and vegetables once grew where tulips now stand in regimented rows. The transformation began in 1949, when local flower growers saw an opportunity to showcase Dutch bulbs to the world. What started as a trade exhibition became something far larger. Visitors now arrive from every continent, timing their trips to catch the brief window when the gardens reach full bloom. Walking the winding paths reveals careful design beneath the apparent wildness. Tulips dominate, but hyacinths, daffodils, and crocuses fill the spaces between. Colors shift from section to section, moving through reds and oranges into purples and whites. The scent hangs heavy in spring air, sweet and almost overwhelming. Pavilions display more delicate specimens, orchids and lilies protected from wind and rain. Beyond the formal beds, old trees arch overhead, their branches framing views across the flower fields that stretch toward the horizon. Not far from these flowering fields, one ancient canal town earned its place through knowledge rather than trade alone. Leiden rises quietly from the water, its narrow streets holding secrets that shaped modern thought. This is where the Dutch rewarded courage with learning, founding a university that would draw scholars from across the known world. The city's brick facades and arched bridges hide lecture halls where ideas once considered dangerous found sanctuary. Leiden University opened its doors in 1575. A gift from William of Orange to a city that had survived Spanish siege. Students walked these same cobblestones when Rembrandt was born here. When Spinoza sought refuge for his philosophy, when pilgrims gathered before sailing west to a place they would call Plymouth. The Botanical Garden, among the oldest in Europe, still grows plants first catalogued by physicians studying the healing properties of specimens brought back from distant voyages. Knowledge accumulated here like sediment, layer upon layer. Today, the university spreads across the old city centre. Its buildings mixed among homes and shops as though learning itself had grown organically from daily life. Bicycles lean against walls, where Latin inscriptions mark entrances to libraries holding manuscripts from the Renaissance. Students fill cafes that spill onto canal-side terraces. There's continuing conversations that began centuries ago in different languages, but with the same restless curiosity. Leiden remains a place where the past informs the present, where walking through an ordinary doorway might lead to something remarkable. Eastward from Leiden's halls of learning, Amersfoort rises where ancient trade routes once crossed. Its stone walls softened by centuries of weather. Located in the heart of the Netherlands, this settlement rose along the banks of the Eem River. Its old centre remains remarkably intact, a living record of Dutch urban life stretching back to the Middle Ages. Here, the past does not hide behind modern facades, but stands openly in brick and stone. The Koppelpoort Gate rises where water and land meet at the edge of the old city. Built in the late 1300s, this structure served both as a land gate and a water gate, controlling access from either approach. Two round towers flank a central passage, their reflections doubling in the canal below. Wooden beams and iron mechanisms once raised and lowered barriers against unwanted visitors. The gate still functions, its medieval engineering preserved for anyone who pauses to look. Beyond the Koppelpoort, the medieval walls trace the boundaries of what was once a fortified trading town. Sections of these defenses still stand, punctuated by towers that watched over approaches from every direction. Walking along their remnants reveals how seriously the people of Amersfoort took their protection. These walls witnessed sieges, plagues, and the slow march of peace that eventually made them unnecessary. Today they frame quiet streets where bicycles outnumber soldiers and cafes occupy spaces once meant for guards. South of Amersfoort's fortified walls, Utrecht rises with quiet authority at the country's geographic heart, its church towers commanding the skyline. Canals run deeper here than in other Dutch cities. Their wharves built below street level where medieval sellers once stored goods from distant ports. This was a religious capital before Amsterdam claimed commercial supremacy. The old city centre retains that earlier gravity, its streets radiating outward from a cathedral that lost its nave to a storm but kept its soaring tower. The Dom Tower stands alone now, separated from what remains of the cathedral by an open square where the collapsed nave once connected them. Construction began in the early 1300s and continued for decades, each generation adding height until the tower reached more than 112 meters. For centuries, it served as the tallest structure in the Low Countries. Climbing its 465 steps reveals the city in layers, from the red rooftops directly below to the distant farms that stretch toward every horizon. Bells still ring from chambers where carillonneurs have played since the 1600s. Beyond the city walls, past villages and polders, De Haar Castle rises from flat farmland like something borrowed from a fairy tale. The largest castle in the Netherlands, it was rebuilt entirely between 1892 and 1912 after centuries of ruin. Towers topped with conical spires punctuate walls of red brick trimmed in white. Inside, rooms overflow with tapestries, porcelain, and paintings collected by the Van Zuylen family across generations. Gardens designed in formal French style give way to English parkland, where ancient trees shade paths that wind toward a distant horizon. Leaving Utrecht's ancient spires behind, a different Netherlands waits in the eastern province of Gelderland. Hoge Veluwe National Park spreads across more than 5,000 hectares of land that feels untouched by the centuries of human intervention that defines so much of this country. Here, the flat horizon gives way to rolling dunes, dense forests, and open heathland. This is one of the largest continuous nature reserves in the Netherlands, a place where the wild persists. The landscape shifts as visitors move through the park. Sandy paths wind through pine and oak woodlands before opening onto purple heather fields that bloom in late summer. Shifting sand dunes rise and fall like frozen waves, their surfaces rippled by wind. Red deer graze in clearings at dawn, their silhouettes sharp against the morning mist. Wild boar root through the undergrowth, while mouflon sheep watch from distant ridges. The air carries the scent of pine resin and damp earth. White bicycles stand freely throughout the park, available to anyone who wishes to explore. These simple machines have become a symbol of Hoge Veluwe, offering quiet passage through landscapes too vast for walking alone. Cycling paths stretch in every direction, leading past hidden ponds and ancient burial mounds. At the center of the park, the Kröller-Müller Museum houses one of the largest collections of Van Gogh paintings in the world. Surrounded by a sculpture garden where art meets forest. Nature and culture exist here in rare balance, each giving meaning to the other. Returning westward from the wild heathlands, we reach a city where human will shapes not just the landscape, but the fate of nations. The Hague rises along the western coast, a place where diplomacy and power have gathered for centuries. Unlike Amsterdam, with its merchant canals, or Rotterdam, with its busy ports, this city built itself around governance and law. Grand boulevards stretch between stately buildings, their architecture speaking of decisions that shaped nations far beyond Dutch borders. The Peace Palace stands behind ornate iron gates, its red brick towers visible above manicured gardens. Completed in 1913 with funds from Andrew Carnegie, and this building was meant to settle disputes between nations through law rather than war. The International Court of Justice now meets within its walls. Delegations from across the world walk these halls, seeking resolutions to conflicts that might otherwise tear countries apart. Stained glass windows filter light into chambers where arguments unfold in measured tones. The Binnenhof occupies the oldest part of the city, a complex of buildings surrounding a central courtyard. Counts of Holland established their residence here in the 13th century. Today, the Dutch Parliament conducts its work within these same walls. The Ridderzaal, or Hall of Knights, and hosts the annual opening of Parliament when the monarch arrives by golden coach. Centuries of political history have unfolded across these cobblestones, from medieval councils to modern debates. Scheveningen Beach offers a different character entirely, spreading along the North Sea shore, just minutes from government buildings. Wide sands stretch toward cold grey waters where fishing boats once launched each morning. A long pier extends into the waves, its lights glowing against evening skies. Families gather here when summer warmth arrives, though wind never truly leaves this coast. The contrast between formal city centre and open shoreline reveals the full range of what The Hague contains. Minutes from The Hague's grand boulevards, Delft holds a particular place in Dutch memory. Among the medieval towns where church towers rise above market squares. This small city sits between Rotterdam and The Hague, its canals reflecting the same wide sky that covers the entire country. Brick bridges arch over still water. Tree-lined streets lead past facades that have changed little since the Golden Age. Delft gave the world its famous blue pottery, but it gave the Netherlands something more enduring, a burial place for its royal house and a keeper of its oldest stories. The Nieuwe Kerk, or New Church, commands the central market square with a Gothic spire that climbs nearly 100 meters into the air. Despite its name, this church is more than 600 years old, its construction beginning in 1381. The tower took another century to complete, rising stone by stone above a city that was growing wealthy from trade and craft. Today, that spire remains the second tallest church tower in the Netherlands, visible from the surrounding countryside as a landmark that has guided travelers for generations. Inside the Nieuwe Kerk, the air grows cool and quiet. Light falls through tall windows onto stone floors, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. This is where William of Orange, father of the Dutch nation, lies buried in an elaborate marble tomb designed by Hendrik de Keyser. Since his assassination in 1584, members of the House of Orange-Nassau have been interred in the royal crypt below. The church serves not only as a place of worship, but as a monument to Dutch independence, a reminder of the struggle that created the nation itself. Visitors climb the tower for views across Delft and beyond, where the flat green landscape stretches toward distant horizons. Northeast of Delft, another medieval town holds firm to tradition, as Gouda rises quietly from the South Holland countryside. This small city carries a name known far beyond its borders, yet the place itself remains genuinely Dutch. Canals wind past brick facades that have weathered 5 centuries of seasons. Church spires and merchant houses crowd together around a central square, where commerce and community have always mixed. The cheese market transforms the market square each Thursday morning during summer months. Farmers and traders have gathered here since the late 1600s, their rituals barely changed across generations. Yellow wheels of cheese stack in neat rows across the cobblestones, onto their waxy rinds catching morning light. Porters in white uniforms and colored straw hats carry wooden sledges between cellars and weighing houses. The clapping of hands seals deals made in a language of gestures older than written contracts. Beyond the theatre of the market, the square holds its own quiet presence. The Gothic town hall stands at one end, its stone facade decorated with figures of counts and countesses from distant centuries. The Hague, The old weighing house anchors the opposite side, where cheese has been measured and taxed since 1595. Visitors come for the spectacle, but locals move through on ordinary errands. Hear their footsteps crossing paths that generations before them also walked. West of Gouda, where the great rivers finally reach the sea, Rotterdam rises from the delta in steel and glass. This city bears little resemblance to the medieval towns that dot the Dutch countryside. Bombed nearly flat during the Second World War, Rotterdam rebuilt itself as something entirely new. Modern architecture stands where old streets once wound between canal houses. A skyline that looks forward rather than back. The port of Rotterdam stretches for more than 40 kilometers along the waterway. It ranks among the largest ports in the world, a gateway where Europe meets global shipping lanes. Container ships the length of city blocks slide past industrial cranes that never stop moving. Oil refineries and chemical plants line the banks, their towers releasing steam into the grey Dutch sky. This is where the engineering spirit of the Netherlands takes its most visible form. Infrastructure on a scale that defies easy comprehension. The Erasmus Bridge spans the Nieuwe Maas River with elegant asymmetry. Its single white pylon rises at an angle, cables fanning out like strings of an instrument. Locals call it the Swan for the graceful curve of its tower. Opened in 1996, the bridge connects the old northern city centre to the developing southern districts. At night, lights trace its lines against the darkness, a modern landmark for a city that refuses to stand still. Pedestrians and cyclists cross alongside traffic, the river moving steadily beneath them toward the open sea. Just east of Rotterdam's modern skyline, that story of negotiation with water finds its purest expression at Kinderdijk. Here, in the low-lying polder south of Rotterdam, 19 windmills stand in 2 rows along parallel canals. They have stood this way since the 1740s, when engineers built them to drain the Alblasserwaard region. Today, they form the largest concentration of historic windmills anywhere in the Netherlands. The windmill network at Kinderdijk represents more than preservation. These structures still function as they did nearly 3 centuries ago. Their sails turn when conditions require, lifting water from the lower polder into higher collection basins. From there, the water flows toward rivers and eventually the sea. Each mill served a specific section of land. And together, they created a system that kept an entire region dry enough to farm and inhabit. Walking the paths between these mills reveals the scale of what the Dutch built by hand. Reed beds line the waterways, filtering and slowing the flow. Brick bases support wooden towers that creak in the wind. Some mills open to visitors, showing the cramped quarters where families once lived while tending the machinery above their heads. The landscape itself feels engineered, every ditch and embankment placed with purpose. Nothing left to chance in a place where nature would reclaim everything within months if the pumping stopped. From Kinderdijk's historic windmills, we travel southwest to Zeeland, where the Dutch relationship with water finds its most dramatic expression in massive storm surge gates. Here in this province of islands and peninsulas, the sea once broke through with devastating force. The response took decades to build and changed the coastline forever. The Delta works stand as one of the largest flood protection systems ever constructed by human hands. The Oosterscheldekering stretches nearly 9 kilometers across the eastern Scheldt estuary. 62 massive steel gates rest between concrete piers, each one capable of dropping closed when storm surges threaten. Engineers designed this barrier differently from the others in the Delta works. Rather than permanently sealing off the sea, it allows tides to flow through during normal conditions. This choice preserved the saltwater ecosystem and the mussel and oyster beds that local fishermen had worked for generations. Neeltje Jans sits at the heart of this engineering achievement. An artificial island that served as the construction base during the barrier's creation. Today, it welcomes visitors who want to understand what the Dutch accomplished here. The scale only becomes clear when standing beside one of the original sluice gates on display. Water parks and exhibits now occupy the island. Yeah, but the serious purpose behind everything remains visible in the massive infrastructure stretching toward both horizons. From Zeeland's coastal defenses, we turn inland to a city where Dutch ingenuity shaped something else entirely. Eindhoven sits in the province of North Brabant, far from the famous canals and gabled houses of the West. This is a different kind of Dutch place. Where other cities preserved their medieval cores, Eindhoven rebuilt itself around factories and forward motion. The city began as a small market town, quiet and unremarkable for centuries. Then came the light bulb. In 1891, a company called Philips opened its first factory here, producing carbon filament lamps in a modest brick building. That single decision altered everything. Workers arrived from across the region. Neighborhoods rose around the expanding facilities. By the middle of the 20th century, Eindhoven had grown into an industrial powerhouse. Its skyline marked by smokestacks and research laboratories. Today, the factories have mostly closed or transformed into creative spaces. The Stripe S district, once restricted grounds where Philips developed radio technology, now hosts design studios and cultural venues. Old industrial halls stand alongside modern structures of glass and steel. The streets carry an energy that feels younger than most Dutch cities. Shaped by technical universities and design academies that draw students from around the world. Eindhoven does not look backward with nostalgia. It carries its industrial past into present purpose, a city still building what did not exist before. Continuing south from Eindhoven's industrial landscape, the terrain itself begins to change as gentle hills emerge where a different story unfolds. Maastricht sits at the narrow tip of the country, wedged between Belgium and Germany, where the River Meuse has carved its path for thousands of years. This is the oldest city in the Netherlands, a place where Roman soldiers once marched and medieval merchants built fortunes. The ground here was never pulled from the sea. It was always solid, always waiting. Stone defines this city in ways that brick defines the north. Limestone walls glow warm in afternoon light, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of hands and weather. The Vrijthof Square opens wide beneath church towers that have watched over market days since the Middle Ages. Beneath the streets, tunnels stretch for kilometers through old marl quarries. Cool passages where wartime refugees once sheltered and ancient drawings still mark the walls. The city builds upward and downward at once, layering history in every direction. Maastricht moves at its own pace, unhurried by the commerce that drives cities to the north. Cafes spill onto cobblestone squares, where the sound of 3 languages mingles in conversation. The accent here carries traces of German and French, a reminder that borders meant little when these streets were first laid. Walking the old ramparts or crossing the Sint-Servaasbrug, one of the oldest bridges in the country, the weight of time becomes something felt rather than studied. This corner of the Netherlands stands apart, holding on to an identity shaped more by rivers and hills than by the endless battle against the sea. Returning north from the hills of Maastricht, few medieval towns preserve their history as completely as Naarden. This fortified town sits east of Amsterdam, its shape unmistakable from above. A perfect six-pointed star emerges from the landscape, formed by walls, moats, and earthen ramparts that have protected this place for centuries. What remains here is not a ruin or a museum piece, but a living community still contained within its original defenses. The fortifications date to the late 1600s, rebuilt after Spanish forces destroyed an earlier settlement. Double moats filled with water surround the entire town, their surfaces reflecting the brick bastions that rise between them. Grass-covered ramparts slope outward at precise angles, designed to deflect cannonballs and expose attackers to defensive fire. Walking the perimeter reveals the careful geometry of military engineering, each corner calculated for maximum protection. Inside the walls, the town maintains a quieter rhythm. Cobblestone streets lead past brick houses with stepped gables, their facades unchanged for generations. The Grote Kerk anchors the central square, its tower visible from every corner of the star. Each spring, the church hosts performances of the St. Matthew Passion, a tradition unbroken since 1870. Naarden exists as proof that preservation and daily life need not conflict, that the past can hold the present without suffocating it. West of Naarden's star-shaped fortifications, this relationship between water and human ambition shows itself most clearly in Amsterdam. The capital city rises from marshland that should never have supported such weight. Yet here it stands, built upon millions of wooden piles driven deep into soft earth. Concentric waterways ring the old center, a pattern laid out in the 1600s that still defines the city today. The canal ring unfolds like a map of Golden Age prosperity. 3 main canals curve outward from the medieval core, their banks lined with narrow houses that lean slightly forward. Merchants built these homes with hoisting beams at the top, designed to lift goods from boats below. Elm trees shade the water's edge, their reflections doubling the scene. Houseboats sit moored along quieter stretches, some holding families who have lived aboard for generations. Along the Prinsengracht Canal stands a building that draws visitors for reasons far removed from architecture. The Anne Frank House preserves the hidden rooms where a Jewish family spent more than 2 years in hiding during the Second World War. A bookcase still conceals the entrance to the secret annex. The diary written within those walls became one of the most widely read documents of the 20th century. Silence fills the narrow spaces where footsteps once had to remain unheard. South of the Canal District, the city opens into Museumplein, a broad green space surrounded by cultural institutions. The Rijksmuseum anchors one end, its red brick towers visible from across the lawn. The Van Gogh Museum and Stedelijk Museum stand nearby, each holding collections that span centuries of Dutch creativity. Locals gather on the grass when weather permits, their conversations mixing with the distant sound of street musicians. The square breathes differently than the tight canal streets, offering room to pause before moving on. From Amsterdam's concentric canals to the farthest reaches of this remarkable country, the water still moves through everything, pressing against dikes and pooling in waterways that have carried boats for centuries. This is a country that exists because people decided it should, building what the sea never intended to give them and maintaining it through every generation that followed. From the tidal flats of the Wadden Sea to the storm barriers of the Delta Works, from the silent canals of Giethoorn to the turning windmills at Kinderdijk, the Netherlands reveals itself as a place where patience and engineering created something remarkable from marsh and seabed. Click on the video that's appearing now to continue your journey of the wonders of the world.